May 14, 1943. Processing camp, Oran, Algeria. Obergefreiter Klaus Richter sat on the dusty ground with 30 other newly captured German soldiers, watching American guards distribute small rectangular boxes. The boxes, olive drab with stenciled lettering, were being handed to each prisoner, along with a canteen of water. Richter recognized them from intelligence briefings. American K rations, the field rations that Nazi propaganda had mocked as evidence of American military weakness. Feldwebel Otto Schneider, a career soldier who had fought in Poland, France, and now Africa, opened his box and began examining the contents. He pulled out cans, packages, and small items wrapped in waxed paper, laying them on the ground with theatrical disdain. The other prisoners gathered around, curious about their first encounter with American military food. "Look at this," Schneider announced loudly in German, holding up a small can. "Meat and egg product. Not meat, not eggs, but product. The Americans cannot even name what they feed their soldiers." He opened the can with the provided key and sniffed the contents. "It smells like what we fed the pigs on my father's farm." The prisoners laughed, emboldened by Schneider's mockery. They had been raised on Nazi propaganda that portrayed Americans as soft, materialistic, and incapable of the discipline required for military excellence. The K-ration seemed to confirm these teachings. How could a nation that fed its soldiers such obvious garbage hope to defeat the Wehrmacht? Richter opened his own ration. Inside the box, he found a can of processed meat, crackers that looked like compressed cardboard, a fruit bar that resembled tree bark, instant coffee that was more powder than bean, cigarettes, chewing gum, and toilet paper. The assortment seemed random and unappetizing. Surely the Wehrmacht's iron rations, while Spartan, were superior to this American confusion of processed foods. "This is what the great American industrial machine produces," Schneider continued, his voice dripping with contempt. "Mystery meat in cans, crackers that could be used as roof tiles, and coffee that dissolves in water because it is not actually coffee. No wonder they are losing in North Africa. An army that eats like this cannot fight." The irony, lost on Schneider and the others at that moment, was that they had not eaten a full meal in 3 days. The Africa Corps supply lines had collapsed. Rommel's army had been on half rations for weeks before the final surrender. The prisoners were hungry enough that even mockery couldn't prevent them from eating the K rations they were criticizing. As Richter ate, he noticed something troubling. The food, while unappetizing in appearance, was filling. The crackers, though hard and bland, were dense with calories. The meat product, despite its suspicious texture, provided protein his body desperately needed. The fruit bar, sticky and too sweet, gave him energy. The coffee, weak though it was, contained real caffeine. By the time he finished the ration, he felt fuller than he had in days. An American sergeant, listening to the German mockery with amusement, approached the group. He spoke in broken but comprehensible German, learned from a grandfather who had immigrated before the First World War. "You think that is bad food? That is emergency ration, for when soldiers cannot get regular meals. Tomorrow, when you get to the main camp, you will see what American soldiers really eat. Then you can laugh if you want." The prisoners dismissed this as propaganda. Of course, the Americans would claim better food existed elsewhere. It was psychological warfare, attempting to demoralize them by suggesting they were receiving inferior treatment. The Wehrmacht had taught them to expect such tactics. They knew that in war, everyone exaggerated their strength and minimized their weakness. What Klaus Richter and his fellow prisoners didn't know, what Nazi intelligence had catastrophically failed to report, what would become devastatingly clear in the coming days and weeks, was that the K-ration they were mocking represented the absolute baseline of American military feeding. It was the minimum, the emergency provision, the ration of last resort. What American soldiers actually ate, day after day, in bases and camps and field kitchens across the world, exceeded what most German soldiers had eaten. Even before the war began, the story of how German prisoners of war went from mocking American military food to being psychologically transformed by its abundance reveals the vast gulf between Nazi propaganda and American reality. It demonstrates how totalitarian regimes, unable to match democratic industrial capacity, instead chose to lie about it, creating illusions that shattered upon first contact with truth. And it shows how something as simple as food, more than any formal re-education program, could demolish ideological certainty by presenting undeniable physical evidence of American superiority. The K-ration that Schneider had mocked with such confidence represented a triumph of American food science and industrial production. Developed in 1941 by physiologist Ansel Keys at the University of Minnesota, the K-ration was designed to provide a complete, balanced meal in a compact, durable package that could be carried by individual soldiers and consumed without preparation. Each K ration box contained approximately 3,000 calories worth of food, divided into breakfast, dinner, and supper units. The breakfast unit included a canned meat product, usually corned beef hash or veal loaf, crackers, a compressed cereal bar, soluble coffee, sugar tablets, and cigarettes. The dinner unit contained a different meat product, often cheese or processed beef, crackers, a candy bar, lemon powder for making a drink, cigarettes, and gum. The supper unit had yet another meat variety: crackers, a bouillon cube, a fruit bar, coffee, and more cigarettes. The packaging was revolutionary. Waxed cartons protected contents from moisture. Individual items were sealed in waterproof materials. The entire box could be dropped, submerged briefly, or exposed to extreme temperatures without significant deterioration. The can opener, cigarettes, matches, toilet paper, and even the gum served specific functions in maintaining soldier morale and health. German intelligence had analyzed captured K rations and concluded they were evidence of American decadence. Never understanding, they represented the minimum acceptable standard. The actual nutritional content of K rations exceeded what most German soldiers received even in the best circumstances. The 3,000 calories per day, delivered through carefully balanced proteins, fats, and carbohydrates, maintained combat effectiveness indefinitely. German rations, by comparison, provided approximately 2,500 to 2,800 calories per day in theory, often less in practice due to supply disruptions, but K rations were never intended for long-term use. American military doctrine specified that K rations were for short-duration field operations, typically not exceeding 2 weeks. For sustained operations, soldiers received C rations, canned meals that provided more variety and better nutrition. And whenever possible, American forces established field kitchens, serving hot meals prepared from fresh ingredients. May 15, 1943. POW camp, Oran, Algeria. Klaus Richter lined up with 500 other prisoners for his first regular camp meal. The line led to a series of serving tables, where American cooks, assisted by Italian prisoners who had been in custody longer, were dishing out food from enormous pots and trays. The smell that reached Richter as he approached made his stomach clench with hunger. Real food, cooked food, more food than the K ration that had seemed so substantial the previous day. He received a metal tray and moved down the serving line. A cook placed 2 pieces of fried chicken on his tray, each piece larger than his fist. Another cook added a mound of mashed potatoes with a ladle of brown gravy. Green beans followed, then 2 slices of white bread with butter, and finally, impossibly, a slice of apple pie. The tray was so heavy and so laden with food that Richter struggled to carry it to the tables where prisoners were eating. Obergefreiter Franz Weber, sitting next to Richter, stared at his tray in confusion. "This is a mistake," Weber said. "They gave us officers' rations. They will realize the error and take it back." But looking around, Richter saw that every prisoner had received the same amount of food, and American guards were eating at adjacent tables, their trays containing the same fried chicken, potatoes, bread, and pie. The meal was eaten in near silence, prisoners too focused on the food to speak. Many, like Richter, had not eaten fresh chicken in months or even years. The mashed potatoes were smooth and creamy with real butter. The bread was white, soft, made from refined flour that had become rare in Germany even before the war. The apple pie, sweet and warm, seemed like something from a dream. When Feldwebel Schneider finished his meal, he looked at the empty tray for a long moment before speaking. "This was one meal," he said quietly. "A special meal, perhaps, to show us what they can do. Tomorrow will be different." But his voice lacked the confidence of the previous day. He was trying to reconcile what Nazi propaganda had taught him with what he had just experienced, and the cognitive dissonance was visible on his face. Richter noticed American guards scraping uneaten food into waste bins. One guard, having taken only a few bites of his pie, threw the rest away. Another disposed of half a piece of chicken. The casual waste of food, the indifference to abundance that Germans had learned to treat as precious, was perhaps more shocking than the abundance itself. These Americans had so much food that they could afford to waste it without thought or guilt. That evening, Richter began a diary that he would maintain throughout his captivity, recording observations that seemed too impossible to be true. His first entry read, "Day 2 in American captivity. We received a meal that exceeded anything I ate in the Wehrmacht. Chicken, potatoes, vegetables, bread, and dessert. All of it fresh, all of it abundant. The Americans eat this every day, they say. Their guards eat the same food. They throw away what they cannot finish. Either this is an elaborate deception, invention, or everything we were told about American weakness was a lie. I no longer know what to believe. The systematic feeding of German prisoners according to American military standards was not accidental or exceptional. It reflected the United States Army's commitment to following Geneva Convention requirements while simultaneously demonstrating American industrial and agricultural capacity. The psychological impact of this food abundance on prisoners who had been raised on Nazi propaganda about American degeneracy and weakness was profound and, from an intelligence perspective, valuable. The daily caloric intake for German prisoners in American custody was standardized at 3,300 to 3,600 calories, depending on labor assignments. Prisoners performing heavy physical labor received additional rations. This baseline exceeded what German soldiers received even in the best circumstances and far exceeded what German civilians were receiving. As the war progressed and Allied bombing disrupted food distribution, a typical daily menu for prisoners in American camps included breakfast of eggs, bacon or sausage, toast or pancakes, coffee with cream and sugar, and fruit or juice. Lunch consisted of soup, a main course of meat with vegetables, bread, dessert, and beverages. Dinner offered a different meat, potatoes or rice, vegetables, bread, dessert, coffee, and milk. The variety ensured adequate nutrition while preventing the monotony that characterized German military rations. The comparison with Wehrmacht rations revealed the vast disparity in industrial and agricultural capacity between Germany and America. The standard German field ration, when available in full, included 700 grams of bread, 250 grams of meat, 200 grams of vegetables, and smaller amounts of fats, sugar, and coffee. Substitute. This theoretical daily ration provided approximately 2,800 calories, but was frequently unavailable in full due to supply disruptions, particularly on the Eastern Front and in the final years of the war. German soldiers fighting in North Africa, where Richter and his fellows had been captured, had been on reduced rations for months. The British naval blockade and Allied air superiority had made supply by sea increasingly dangerous. Convoys that reached North Africa often carried ammunition and fuel rather than food, prioritizing combat capability over nutrition. By the time of the final surrender in Tunisia in May 1943, many German and Italian soldiers were on half rations or less, contributing to the collapse of combat effectiveness. The psychological impact of American food abundance on German prisoners was documented extensively by camp intelligence officers tasked with assessing prisoner morale and identifying candidates for re-education programs. Their reports, declassified decades after the war, revealed that food was consistently cited as the single most powerful factor in undermining Nazi ideology among prisoners. A June 1943 intelligence summary from POW camps in North Africa stated, German prisoners express consistent surprise at quality and quantity of food provided. Many initially believe they are receiving special treatment or that abundance is temporary propaganda measure. Sustained exposure to American feeding standards, particularly observation that American guards eat identical food, is creating recognition that Nazi propaganda regarding American weakness was false. Recommend continued standard feeding as most effective psychological warfare tool. If you're fascinated by how something as fundamental as food became a weapon in the psychological war against Nazi ideology, make sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell. We're uncovering the personal transformations and cultural shocks that reveal how wars are won in hearts and minds as much as on battlefields. Don't miss what's coming next. By June 1943, when the first large groups of German prisoners arrived at camps in the United States, the pattern of initial mockery followed by shocked recognition was well established. Prisoners who had maintained ideological commitment despite military defeat found their certainty eroded by something as simple as regular access to meat, fresh bread, and dessert. Camp Aliceville, Alabama, received its first German prisoners in June 1943. Among them was Unteroffizier Johann Weber, a committed Nazi Party member who had joined the Wehrmacht in 1939. Weber was determined to maintain his ideological purity despite captivity, organizing resistance to American re-education efforts and intimidating prisoners who showed friendliness toward captors. Weber's diary, confiscated by American authorities and preserved in the National Archives, documented his gradual psychological transformation. The first entries maintained rigid Nazi ideology. The Americans attempt to corrupt us with food. They believe German soldiers can be bought with full stomachs. We must resist this deception. Our hunger is honorable sacrifice for the Führer. Their abundance is decadent weakness that will lead to their defeat. But subsequent entries revealed growing cognitive dissonance. Third week in camp, the food continues. Every meal includes meat, Today we received steak, actual beef steak, cooked to order. I requested mine well done. The American cook complied without question, as if prisoners' preferences mattered. In Germany, I never ate steak. My family was prosperous, my father a party official, yet we never had such meat. How can the Americans feed prisoners better than Germany feeds its loyal citizens? This suggests their industrial capacity exceeds what we were told. If they lie about American capacity, what else is false? The transformation accelerated through the summer. August. Today I assisted in the camp kitchen. Part of my work assignment. I witnessed food preparation for 2,000 prisoners. The quantities are staggering. This single camp consumes more food daily than my entire hometown consumed monthly before the war. The supplies arrive continuously, by rail, from all across America. The Americans have so much food, they can feed thousands of enemy prisoners without apparent strain. This is not weakness, this is strength beyond German capacity to match. By September, Weber's ideological commitment had collapsed. I can no longer deny what I see daily. The Americans possess industrial and agricultural capacity that makes German production appear primitive. They feed their prisoners better than we fed our soldiers. They waste more food than we produce. Most devastating is the realization that this abundance is normal for them, not special effort for propaganda. American guards eat the same food. Civilian workers at the camp eat the same food. This is simply how Americans live. Everything the party taught us about American weakness was a lie. If they lied about this, what else was false? The racial theories? The Jewish conspiracy? The inevitability of German victory? I am beginning to suspect that everything I believed was wrong. The food abundance that transformed prisoners like Weber was rooted in American agricultural productivity that exceeded anything in human history. The United States in 1943 produced food sufficient to feed not only its own population of 136 million people and 15 million military personnel, but also to export vast quantities to Allied nations and feed several 100,000 prisoners of war. The statistics revealed the scale of American agricultural dominance. In 1943, American farms produced over 3 billion bushels of grain, 700 million pounds of beef, 35 billion pounds of milk, and proportional quantities of poultry, pork, vegetables, and fruit. This production occurred while millions of American men were in military service, demonstrating that mechanization and efficiency had created productivity that exceeded labor limitations. The mechanization of American agriculture was key to this abundance. In 1943, American farms operated over 1,600,000 tractors, compared to approximately 50,000 in Germany. Mechanical harvesters, planters, and processing equipment allowed small numbers of farmers to cultivate vast areas and harvest enormous yields. The industrial infrastructure supporting agriculture, including fertilizer production, seed development, and food processing, represented investment and capability that Germany couldn't match. The food processing industry exemplified American industrial capacity. Companies like Hormel, Swift, Campbell's, and General Foods operated massive facilities that transformed raw agricultural products into canned, frozen, and preserved foods that could be stored, transported, and distributed globally. The C rations and K rations that fed American military forces and prisoners were products of industrial food production operating at scales Germany had never attempted. The transportation infrastructure that distributed food across America and to military forces worldwide demonstrated organizational capability that German prisoners found incomprehensible. Refrigerated rail cars moved fresh produce from California to East Coast ports. Refrigerated ships transported food across oceans. The logistics network that ensured American soldiers in the Pacific, Europe, and Africa received fresh food regularly operated with efficiency that German logistics officers, studying the system after capture, admitted exceeded anything the Wehrmacht had achieved. German prisoners working on American farms, part of the labor program that addressed agricultural workforce shortages, witnessed American agricultural productivity firsthand. The experience was transformative for men raised on Nazi propaganda about American industrial weakness and the superiority of German methods. Gefreiter Hans Müller, assigned to a wheat farm in Kansas in summer 1944, wrote in a letter home, "We work on a farm that one family operates. Just 3 people, the farmer, his wife, and his elderly father, manage 4,000 acres. In Germany, such land would require 100 farmers. Here, they use machines for everything. The combine harvester cuts, threshes, and bags wheat in one operation. I watched it harvest 100 acres in a single day. The entire annual wheat production of my village could be matched by this one machine in 2 days. The farmer says, this is normal for American agriculture. Mother, we were told Americans were lazy and inefficient. The opposite is true. They work smarter, not harder, and produce quantities we cannot imagine. The meat production that provided prisoners with daily access to beef, pork, and poultry reflected American agricultural efficiency applied to animal husbandry. The feedlot system, using mechanized grain production to fatten cattle rapidly, produced beef at scales that made regular meat consumption affordable even for working-class Americans. German prisoners, most of whom had eaten meat rarely before the war and almost never during military service, found the daily availability of meat to be the most shocking aspect of American abundance. Camp Hearn, Texas, developed a reputation among prisoners for particularly generous feeding, though in reality, it simply followed standard American military guidelines. The camp's proximity to cattle ranches meant beef was especially plentiful. Prisoners received steak at least once per week, pot roast or beef stew multiple times per week, and ground beef in various preparations nearly daily. The chicken, pork, and occasional fish provided variety, but not necessarily increased quantity, as meat portions were standardized. Oberstgefreiter Friedrich Schulz, interned at Camp Hearn from August 1943 through March 1946, maintained detailed records of meals served. His log, preserved in family archives, documented over 1,000 meals consumed during captivity. The repetition of entries like beef with potatoes and vegetables, bread, dessert, and chicken with rice, salad, bread, pie revealed the consistency of American military feeding. Schultz's commentary on these meals evolved from skeptical to appreciative. August 1943, they feed us meat daily. This cannot last. September 1943, the meat continues. I have eaten more beef this month than in my entire life before the war. October 1943. Today I realized this is not temporary. This is normal for Americans. March 1944. I no longer record the meat. It is expected. What would be remarkable is if we did not receive meat. June 1944. Worked in kitchen today. Saw the food deliveries. The quantities are continuous. The Americans have organized food production and distribution so efficiently that feeding thousands is routine, not exceptional. The desserts particularly impressed German prisoners. American military meals routinely included pie, cake, cookies, or pudding. The sugar, butter, eggs, and flour required for such desserts had largely disappeared from German civilian diets by 1942, yet Americans served dessert to prisoners daily. The psychological impact of this extravagance was profound, suggesting wealth so vast that luxuries could be casually provided to enemies. The ice cream was revelation. American military policy called for ice cream to be available whenever practical. Considering it important for morale, many POW camps in the United States installed ice cream production equipment, serving frozen desserts regularly during summer months. German prisoners, most of whom had not tasted ice cream since before the war, found the experience almost surreal. Enemies serving them luxuries that German citizens could no longer obtain. Unteroffizier Carl Schmidt wrote in his diary after his first ice cream in 3 years. Today, they served ice cream with chocolate sauce. Ice cream to prisoners. In Germany, children go without milk, yet Americans make frozen cream desserts for enemies. This single act of casual extravagance reveals more about American industrial capacity than any statistic. They have so much, they can afford to make luxuries for those who fought against them. We were told Americans were weak and decadent. Perhaps they are decadent, but that decadence is supported by strength we cannot match. The coffee situation provided another stark contrast. American military coffee, while often criticized by American soldiers as weak or poorly prepared, was real coffee, brewed from roasted beans and served hot with cream and sugar available. German military coffee was increasingly ersatz, made from roasted grains, acorns, or chicory, containing no actual coffee beans. Prisoners who had not tasted real coffee in years found even mediocre American military coffee to be a luxury. Before we continue with how this food abundance completely dismantled Nazi ideology and transformed enemy soldiers into advocates for democracy, take a moment to subscribe if you haven't already. We're bringing you the personal stories and cultural revelations that show how something as simple as daily bread became a weapon more powerful than any gun. Hit that subscribe button and join us for more untold stories from history. The systematic documentation of prisoner reactions to American food abundance served intelligence purposes beyond simple morale assessment. American psychological warfare specialists recognized that prisoners returning to Germany after the war would carry stories of American abundance that would undermine remaining Nazi support and facilitate post-war reconstruction efforts. The decision to feed prisoners according to Geneva Convention standards, and often beyond those requirements, was therefore both humanitarian and strategic. The cost of providing adequate food to approximately 371,000 German prisoners over the course of the war was significant but manageable for American agricultural production. The strategic benefit of creating hundreds of thousands of witnesses to American prosperity was deemed worth the investment. The contrast with German treatment of prisoners was stark and intentional. American authorities ensured German prisoners understood that their treatment exceeded what Allied prisoners received in German camps. Red Cross reports documenting harsh conditions, inadequate food, and high death rates in German prisoner camps were made available to German prisoners, forcing them to confront the disparity between Nazi propaganda about honorable German conduct and the reality of deliberate starvation and abuse. The comparison with Soviet treatment of German prisoners was even more devastating to Nazi ideology. German prisoners who had served on the Eastern Front knew what Soviet captivity meant: forced labor, starvation rations, brutal conditions, and high mortality rates. The stark difference between American and Soviet treatment validated American claims of moral superiority and democratic values, undermining Nazi propaganda that had portrayed all enemies as barbaric and indistinguishable. By late 1944, as Germany's military situation became hopeless and soldiers increasingly recognized that defeat was inevitable, many Wehrmacht personnel preferred surrender to Americans specifically because word had spread about prisoner treatment. Soldiers who had brothers, cousins, or friends in American camps received letters describing food abundance, decent treatment, and hope for survival. This information flow, despite German attempts at censorship, contributed to declining German military morale. The Thanksgiving and Christmas celebrations of 1943, 44, and 45 provided particularly powerful demonstrations of American food abundance. German prisoners received traditional American holiday meals, including turkey, stuffing, multiple side dishes, and multiple desserts. The quantities and variety exceeded what most had experienced, even during peacetime in Germany. Klaus Richter, whose mockery of K-rations in May 1943 had seemed so reasonable to him at the time, experienced his first American Thanksgiving in November 1943 at Camp Hearn. His diary entry captured his transformation. Today, the Americans celebrated Thanksgiving. They invited us to share their feast. Turkey larger than any bird I have seen. Mashed potatoes, sweet potatoes, cranberry sauce, vegetables, bread, and 3 kinds of pie. The Americans ate at tables with us, guards and prisoners together, sharing the same food. This was not propaganda. This was their genuine tradition, extended to enemies. I understood then that we had fundamentally misunderstood these people. A nation that can afford to feast with its prisoners possesses strength beyond military power. It possesses the confidence that comes from absolute security. We mocked their food in May. By November, I understood that the mockery revealed our ignorance, not their weakness. The repatriation of German prisoners beginning in late 1945 created hundreds of thousands of witnesses to American abundance, returning to a Germany that was experiencing severe food shortages. The contrast between the Germany they had left, already under strain, and the Germany they returned to, devastated and starving, was stark. But equally stark was the contrast between wartime deprivation in Germany and the abundance they had experienced as prisoners in America. Former prisoners became inadvertent advocates for Western alignment and Marshall Plan aid. They had seen American productive capacity firsthand. They understood that American assistance was practical and possible, not merely theoretical. They knew that Americans could feed millions without strain because they had witnessed the agricultural and industrial system that made such feeding possible. Ernst Weber, whose letter from a Kansas farm had described mechanical harvesting that exceeded German capacity, returned to his village in Bavaria in April 1946. He found his family home destroyed, his father dead, his mother and sisters living in a basement on rations that provided less than 1,500 calories per day. The comparison with his prisoner experience was almost too painful to articulate. Weber wrote to the American farmer he had worked for, requesting help. "I have returned to find Germany destroyed and my family starving. The food I ate as your prisoner exceeded what my family now receives as free citizens. This realization is devastating. I write to ask if you can send food packages. I also write to tell you that your kindness to me, an enemy prisoner, has transformed my understanding of the world. When Germany is rebuilt, I hope it will be rebuilt along American lines, with democracy, efficiency, and the abundance I witnessed. Thank you for showing me a better way. The American farmer, John Anderson, responded with monthly food packages and an offer to sponsor Weber's immigration to America if desired. This pattern was repeated thousands of times across Germany as former prisoners reached out to Americans they had met during captivity, seeking aid for families and often seeking to maintain connections with the nation that had treated them better as prisoners than their own government had treated them as soldiers. The statistical record of German prisoner treatment validated individual testimonies. Post-war surveys found that 95% of German prisoners rated their treatment as good or excellent. Food was consistently cited as the most positive aspect of captivity. Many former prisoners reported gaining weight during captivity, even while performing physical labor, because the consistent 3,000+ calories per day exceeded what they had received in the Wehrmacht. Medical records confirmed this. The average German prisoner gained between 5 and 8 kilograms during American captivity, despite being assigned to work details that should have maintained or reduced weight. The weight gain reflected adequate nutrition after years of marginal rations, demonstrating through objective physiological evidence what prisoners subjectively reported, that American feeding was not merely adequate, but generous. The food production supporting this prisoner feeding occurred while America was simultaneously feeding its military forces worldwide, supplying Lend-Lease aid to allied nations, and maintaining civilian food consumption at levels that, though reduced by rationing, still exceeded most of the world. This simultaneous capacity, providing food to all these demands without crisis or failure, demonstrated organizational and productive ability that Germany simply lacked. The rationing on the American home front, while real and sometimes inconvenient, maintained average caloric intake above 3,000 calories per day for American civilians. Sugar, butter, meat, and coffee were rationed, but rarely unavailable entirely. The black market was minimal because legal rations were adequate. Americans complained about rationing, but the complaints reflected inconvenience rather than actual deprivation. German civilians, by contrast, were on declining rations that reached crisis levels by 1945. The official rations in German cities by early 1945 provided less than 1,500 calories daily, often less in practice due to distribution failures caused by Allied bombing. Millions of Germans were technically starving, subsisting on levels inadequate for health. The contrast with American abundance, reported by returning prisoners, was devastating to remaining Nazi credibility. The mockery that German prisoners had initially directed at American military food represented a fundamental misunderstanding, born from years of propaganda. Nazi ideology, unable to explain or match American productive capacity, had instead chosen to deny it, claiming that American abundance was illusion and that American industrial strength was exaggerated. This lie, comfortable when unchallenged, shattered upon contact with reality. The K-ration that seemed so pathetic to Feldwebel Schneider in May 1943 was itself a technological achievement, representing American industrial food production, the ability to package balanced nutrition in portable, durable form that required no preparation and lasted indefinitely in various conditions, exceeded anything German food science had achieved. The mockery revealed ignorance, not insight. The regular meals that followed, the daily meat and fresh bread and desserts, the Thanksgiving feasts and Christmas dinners, the ice cream and real coffee, all demonstrated that the K-ration was the minimum, not the standard. What American soldiers regularly ate, and what prisoners received by extension, exceeded what most Germans had ever experienced, including during Germany's brief period of prosperity between the wars. The psychological impact of this realization was profound. German prisoners, raised on propaganda about German superiority and American weakness, confronted daily evidence that the opposite was true. The food, undeniable and physical, couldn't be explained away or rationalized. Hungry men could lie to themselves about many things, but not about whether they had eaten well. The food transformed ideology because it was real in ways that propaganda could never be. Feldwebel Otto Schneider, who had led the mockery of K-rations in May 1943, wrote in a letter to his family in December 1944, "I was wrong about the Americans. We all were wrong. I mocked their food when we were first captured, believing it confirmed what we had been taught about their weakness. Since then, I have eaten better as their prisoner than I ever ate as a free man in Germany. They feed us daily what we ate at Christmas before the war. Their abundance is not propaganda, but reality. If they lied to us about this, the party lied about everything. I am ashamed of my mockery in May. It revealed how successfully the party had made us believe comfortable lies rather than uncomfortable truths. The ultimate irony was that American military food, often criticized by American soldiers as bland, monotonous, or poorly prepared, represented luxury to German prisoners. What Americans complained about, Germans celebrated. What Americans took for granted, Germans marveled at. The gap between American baseline and German aspiration revealed the vast disparity in industrial and agricultural capacity that had made Germany's defeat inevitable. The agricultural statistics told the story plainly. America in 1944 produced approximately 40% of the world's total food output, with approximately 6% of the world's population. This productivity reflected mechanization, efficient land use, scientific farming techniques, and industrial infrastructure that transformed agriculture from subsistence to surplus. Germany, even in the best years before the war, had never achieved food self-sufficiency and depended on imports to feed its population. The decision to allocate food resources to prisoners rather than increasing military rations or civilian consumption reflected American strategic thinking. The food was abundant enough that feeding prisoners didn't meaningfully reduce other allocations. The psychological and intelligence benefits of treating prisoners well, particularly through generous feeding, exceeded the cost. The investment in prisoner welfare paid dividends in cooperation, intelligence gathering, and post-war German attitudes toward America. German prisoners who mocked American Army food in May 1943 learned by November 1943, or certainly by November 1944, that the mockery had been based on ignorance. What happened next shocked them because it forced confrontation with reality that Nazi ideology had carefully hidden. The shock came not from cruelty or deprivation, the treatment they had been taught to expect from enemies, but from generosity and abundance that revealed everything they believed was wrong. The transformation from mockery to appreciation to advocacy took months or years depending on the individual. Some prisoners, particularly committed Nazis, resisted the implications of American food abundance, constructing elaborate rationalizations to maintain ideological purity. But most, confronted daily with evidence of American capacity and German deception, gradually accepted that they had been lied to. Klaus Richter, who had eaten his first K-ration with confusion and mild contempt in May 1943, wrote his final diary entry before repatriation in March 1946. "I returned to Germany tomorrow. I spent 3 years as American prisoner. I ate better during these 3 years than any previous time in my life." This simple fact demolishes everything the Nazi Party taught us about American weakness. A nation that feeds prisoners so well possesses strength beyond military power. It possesses the moral confidence to treat enemies with dignity and the industrial capacity to make that treatment sustainable. I was taught to hate and fear Americans. Instead, I learned to respect and envy them. Germany's future, if we have one, must include learning from American example. The mockery with which I began my captivity seems now like the ignorance it was. What happened next, the abundance and decency I experienced, shocked me into understanding truth the party had hidden. I returned to Germany as different man than the one who was captured. The transformation began with food, but extended to everything. American Army food, which I mocked, was the key that unlocked my ideological prison. The hundreds of thousands of German prisoners who returned to Germany between 1945 and 1948, carrying similar testimonies, formed a constituency for democratic reconstruction and Western alignment. They had witnessed American prosperity and knew it was real. They had experienced American values and found them superior to Nazi ideology. They became, inadvertently, America's most effective advocates in post-war Germany. The Marshall Plan's success in rebuilding Western Germany was facilitated by these former prisoners who told their families, friends, and communities that American aid was genuine and that American prosperity was achievable for Germany if it adopted democratic capitalism. The credibility of these witnesses, who had no reason to lie and every reason to resent their former captors, was immense. When they said America could help rebuild Germany, people believed them because they had seen American capacity firsthand. The story of German prisoners mocking American Army food and then being shocked by the reality reveals a broader truth about totalitarian propaganda versus democratic reality. Lies, even comfortable lies, repeated often, eventually confront truth. When that confrontation occurs, particularly regarding something as fundamental and undeniable as food, the psychological impact is devastating to the ideology built on those lies. Nazi Germany lost the war on battlefields across 3 continents, but it also lost a psychological war in prisoner-of-war camps, where the simple act of feeding enemies adequately demonstrated American superiority more effectively than any propaganda campaign. The mockery that Feldwebel Schneider led in May 1943 was answered not through argument but through the daily reality of American military meals that exceeded German civilian peacetime abundance. What shocked German prisoners was not cruelty but kindness, not deprivation but abundance, not the confirmation of propaganda but its complete refutation. They expected to be treated as they would treat prisoners, harshly and minimally. Instead, they received treatment that exceeded what they had known as free soldiers of their own army. This shock, repeated daily over months or years, transformed ideology because it proved through undeniable physical experience that everything they had been taught was false. The mockery turned to shock, the shock turned to appreciation, and the appreciation turned to advocacy. German prisoners who mocked American army food became witnesses to American abundance, and their testimonies helped shape post-war Germany in ways that formal diplomacy alone could never have achieved. The transformation began with something as simple as K-rations in a processing camp in Algeria and ended with democratic Germany, allied with the West, built partly on foundations laid by former prisoners who learned that America's strength came not from propaganda but from the reality of farmers, factories, and freedom that produced abundance beyond totalitarian comprehension.